Now, let me turn to our third speaker, Mrs. Eleanor Blomstrom. I must say this panel is not only a very distinguished panel, it's also a very diverse panel, and I think that's really an asset. Ms. Blomstrom is head of office and program director of CEDAW. CEDAW, as you, I think, all know, stands for the Women Environment Development Organization. At CEDAW, she has developed many competencies in terms of research, capacity building, and also advocacy at multiple UN fora, including the UNFCCC in climate change, the post-2015 agenda. And prior to CEDAW, Ms. Blomstrom worked on climate change projects and a wide variety of projects, ranging from green roofs to waste management to adaptation. She worked with many different institutions, the Earth Institute at Columbia University, the Clinton Foundation, the World Bank. She has extensive community development experience in the areas of agriculture and women's empowerment. She worked in Latin America, she went in Africa, her work has been informed by a professional background in bilingual elementary education with a focus on race and gender equity in public schools. So she's really dedicated as well and extensive experience in the field. Mrs. Blomstrom will present her views on cities and women and climate change. Mrs. Blomstrom, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I agree our panel is extremely diverse, and I think it's a real opportunity for me to share with you some of the work that I've been doing. And there have been many great points shared so far, and the ambassador was talking about many of the different processes, and just so you know, my main entry point into this currently is the post-2015 process around the Sustainable Development Goals. Very active on that with the Women's Major Group. And I'm sure some of you are out there. The lights are very bright, so I can't tell who's there, but I'm imagining many colleagues are here. And just to get started, WeDo is a global women's advocacy organization, and we work specifically on the intersection of women's rights and environmental justice with the goal of reaching sustainable development and gender equality. And I think all of that is extremely relevant to this panel today. And I also want to stress that it's partnerships really that help WeDo be as influential as we are in our advocacy and policy processes. We wouldn't be able to do the work we do without the partnerships with women at all levels around the world. And I think it's important really to think about this idea of women's leadership and women's leadership and participation in decision making in an inclusive process, because the process itself is as important as the outcomes from that process, and I don't want us to forget that. So today, I would like to center my remarks around the issue of climate change, which is an ongoing crisis, as you all know, that's already impacted communities worldwide, and it's set back the development goals. Here we are reviewing the MDGs and looking at SDGs, but one of the main reasons we have not achieved MDGs is climate change. And so what we need now is immediate, ambitious intervention to halt irreversible damage that would only exacerbate the already existing inequalities that many women face around the world. It's actually an existential crisis. People are losing their islands, their homes. They're being forced to move. It's also, I think, just to reiterate that the environmental degradation is a threat to human rights throughout everywhere on the urban to rural continuum. And if urban development is not done within planetary boundaries, we risk exacerbating those threats, both in the territories of the cities, but also in the remote areas where resources are being exploited. And I use the term exploited in two ways. One, we're using them because it's necessary, but we are, especially in the north, really very much exploiting these resources at the expense of people's lives and not understanding that. And I think we have to understand that, especially those of us here living in cities, and to understand how do we have this amazing place It's really on the backs of people in more remote rural communities. So we need to think about minerals extraction, water, land, resources, and polluting discharges. All of this through a rights perspective. But I don't really want to focus that much on doom and gloom. I think it's important to understand the risks that we face, but it's also important to think really about the opportunities we have in cities, which are immense. Cities are expected to grow in number and in size and diversity. And as we just heard, cities are not only large urban agglomerations, they are small cities, they are villages, and every place is part of this continuum. And what I want to stress most of all are participatory, inclusive actions at the local level to promote and improve gender equality and ensure women can exercise their rights. That's my key message. But all of this within a sustainable development frame. Yes, it should be people-centered, but we have to recognize planetary boundaries. So, there is a framework for women's rights, for climate change, sustainable development. It's important to recognize the legal and normative framework to work with it. City-level authorities have a responsibility to meet the mandates of that as well. What is special about cities is their nimbleness. I think that was said maybe in the SDSN report. But the idea that they can pilot innovative programs, can really take some decisive and progressive action that does benefit people and the planet. And as long as it's based on these guiding principles around rights, safeguards, mandates, there can be great progress. Without that, though, implementation is weak and projects may fail. So what I see is that the transformative ideas can be put forth in planning, infrastructure, transport and mobility, energy, and participation. The things that we want to see in cities that can both address climate change issue and women's rights have to do with safe and green cities, decent work, social protection, lifelong learning opportunities, densely populated societies with transit-oriented development that ensures mobility, access to decision-making and productive resources, thinking about low-carbon development, which has co-benefits for health, for education, for accessibility, and sustainable use of resources from rural areas. So I think you have a good sense of the potential risks. For example, in cities, just to say, with climate change, we expect changing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns. Cities that are densely populated and not well planned do not necessarily have good drainage patterns. They don't have safe water systems. When a flood comes, that impacts the sanitation, the waste management, how women, men, children can have some safe, clean food and water. And then where there's sea level rise, it takes away from resources. Cities like New York have to spend billions of dollars to create infrastructure to save the city from raising sea levels. It's important. This is a city, it's pretty established. However, it's just also important to recognize that building infrastructure requires also reaching out to people. Who lives on the coasts? Who will be displaced? What are their needs? And how do we ensure that the infrastructure is not putting them out in remote areas and then adding 3 hours to their commute time, or making it inaccessible for them to find free or supported education? I think the other issue I just want to say that if we're not thinking about this integrated planning, there's a potential for lock-in of unsustainable infrastructure, whether it's for energy, for water, for transportation. Then, as I've said, local governance should be inclusive and participatory, and take steps to include women's organizations, organized groups, all people, regardless of their age, ethnicity, religion, ability, gender identity, sexual orientation. Every person needs to be involved. And these priorities need to be included in city planning from the beginning, not as an add-on. So I definitely appreciate this idea of collecting data, and what we can use our existing processes like time use surveys and household surveys. It's extremely important. All of this will build resilience to climate change and to disaster among communities. So I think just to leave you with a few examples, and hopefully we'll have a chance during discussion to tell you some more, but to think about in climate change in cities, there can be work towards mitigation, towards halting climate change and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, but also towards adaptation and making sure that communities are resilient and able to withstand any changes in rainfall, that they have the proper resources. And so that might be in production and industry in the north, sustainable consumption and production. And this involves decent work. There may be a changing workforce. How do we train people to be part of that? And also build capacity of those currently in the workforce to see an influx of new faces and new kinds of people joining them in these green jobs. And transportation must be sustainable to create access and mobility. Safety. Energy systems. One quick story, I think, about inclusive decision-making and that you need to reach out to a community. I was talking to someone from a community in Ghana where they were looking at renewable energy, and that was great. There was renewable energy, and it was all focused on outdoor lighting. Whereas this woman said, what I need is energy for my home for cooking, and no one asked me. So there are a lot of different ways to go about this local level planning. And in terms of adaptation, I think also just to consider loss and damage. What's already happening and how do we help people address that? There needs to be funding for this. The finance needs to take on gender budgeting, as we've already talked about, which is extremely important. And I really can't say enough the importance of capacity building for institutions, for decision makers. It can't be something that's lost when the one gender expert takes a new job. It must be within decision makers, and then women's leadership. Women must be able to come from the grassroots to influence decision makers, and this ties to lifelong learning and to women's networks. I think I learned this, I was just in Liberia, and I saw the strength of these women's networks who had been able to work together from grassroots to national level to really influence some land reform. So I think new policies and new laws are sometimes necessary in order to ensure that cities are safe, sustainable, and rights-based in their decision making. Thank you.